Greetings. This is SOGCast number 8. And I want to thank you for joining us today. My name is John Stryker-Meyer. I am your host, courtesy of Jocko Productions. And today we're going to be focusing on one of the epic stories that occurred during the 8-year secret war in Vietnam, fought by the men of SOG, the Special Forces Green Berets and their indigenous troops. And on this mission, we had 136 men, 16 Green Berets, 120 indigenous troops that were assigned deep into Laos to take pressure off of a CIA operation that was further west, that was also under great stress by the NVA. And the team was inserted with Marine Corps helicopters, 4 helicopters, CH-53s, that took them into the target area. And after insertion, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but there is one scene on the first night or the morning of the second day where the command post, where Captain Gene McCarley, who was the officer in charge of the operation, was with his senior intelligence officers, some indigenous troops, and his medic, Gary Mike Rose. And what happened while they were there, an RPG, a rifle-propelled grenade, was launched into that site. And we're reading from SOG Chronicles, Volume 1. And the rocket exploded. Thus, when the shrapnel exploded, those of us who were injured didn't get the full impact because the round had gone past the men, but hit trees, and then the shrapnel exploded backwards, but still with deadly force. And 45 years later, after that rocket explosion, Rose had one lasting mental image from it. It's funny. I can't remember much about it except that all of a sudden I was flying through the air. At some point while airborne, I looked up and saw blue sky. It was beautiful. And then I landed. Later, Captain Gene McCarley told us, Rose showed us what he was made of that day. He immediately started to go to work on the wounded because everyone in the CP, the command post at that time, had varying degrees of wounds. In fact, Rose had a serious foot injury. Somehow the shrapnel had shredded his jungle boot and cut open his foot. Somehow, with that shrapnel, he barely went down and wrapped it around his foot. Then he used his Car-15 as a crutch, and he began treating our wounded. So that's Captain Gene McCarley on that mission on that day, and we'll be talking more about the mission. But today we are honored to have with us Gary Michael Rose, who was the only medic on that mission, that historic mission. Mike, welcome to the show, sir.
Well, thank you.
It's a real pleasure.
And you are again?
My name is Jose.
It's nice to be here, John.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for taking the time. And before we officially began recording, you were talking a little bit about how that moment in time, you're lucky because you described it better than I did. You were explaining how that round went off. It picked you up and threw you through the air, and you were glad to hit your foot instead of your head?
Well, obviously, if I'm looking up and all I'm seeing is blue sky, it looks like I'm upside down. And I can't tell you what the configuration of my body was at that point, but that's all I could remember. It's just a break in the trees of the canopy, and I could see the blue sky. And I did hear this, like that sound when you put a steak on a barbecue.
Yes.
That was the sound of that hot piece of metal going through my foot.
It was your foot at that time sizzling.
And then later on, I got to thinking about it, how you do with hindsight, it's great, 2020, right?
Yeah.
I was just thinking, boy, I'm glad actually I was blown up that way instead of head up, because that could have been my head. Although it might have knocked some sense into me. I don't know.
Indeed. So, this mission, because of the size of it, it was also unique in that when the helicopters first went in, they took relatively heavy gunfire. And a lot of SOG missions, if a helicopter is going in, and they took gunfire. They were obviously compromised. But on this mission, your men continued on. And on your helicopter, were you on the last one that went in
No, I was with
with Gene?
with Gene. I remember standing. Our CCC sergeant major was standing next to me. He was going in with the ride. I guess. It sounds funny, and I'll tell you this. It's kind of, now that I think back, I didn't think it probably at the time, but now that I think, it's kind of comforting that here's a guy that's willing to get on a helicopter to go in there with you, not to stay, but just to ride in and then try to get out. And I can tell you, we were taking rounds from the time almost we crossed the border, because when you hear rounds hitting those CH-53, it sounds like popcorn popping to me.
Is that right?
Yeah. In fact, if you've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan,
Sure.
and when they first going in and the rounds hitting the hulls of those
And the
Higgins boats,
Yeah.
it's about, and I think Higgins boats and helicopters were probably more or less made out of somewhat the same material. I think they were aluminum or whatever. And I might be wrong on that, but boy, it sure sounded the same. But it's comforting to know that, especially when the ship I was on, when we landed, I had to step over a couple of mountain yards. So technically, there were 120
Going in.
but when the helicopters left, they left with at least 2 mountain yards that I know of. They were injured, but they didn't pass away. Thank God for that.
Yeah. So they're wounded on the insertion, which they
were wounded before we even hit the ground.
Yeah. Wow.
So it was a hot LZ going in, and I think the reason that unlike most missions that would be considered compromised, and now you got to understand this is a 74-year-old person thinking about something that happened 51 years ago. Most likely, that mission was to pull NVA troops off of that CIA operation, and they wanted us on the ground. Period.
Indeed.
I mean, it short of being blown out of the sky, I guess, we were going in.
Yeah. And although that term wasn't used at the time, indeed now, 51 years in retrospect, that was essentially, could be called a suicide mission, going in that heavily and with that target area.
Well,
some people yeah.
You rode a few helicopters in Vietnam, and you know how relatively flimsy they are.
Indeed.
Previously I was riding in Hueys.
Yeah.
And this was a big helicopter. It's
the biggest in our helicopters of our air units had at that time.
Well, the reason they got picked was because they had the range.
Sure. Could have gone so deep in the layouts.
And and that was also true why we were using Marine Corps Cobras instead of Army Cobras, because my understanding. Now, you have to understand that I want to make this perfectly clear.
Sure.
I would say 98% of what I know about Operation Tailwind, I have learned since 1998, which was almost 30 years later.
Indeed.
Being told by reading witness statements and talking to people, that aviators and everything else. So,
because you were busy on the ground, patching up your troops.
People weren't you concerned about what's going on around you? And I'd say, well, you've got your training
as a medic.
You have to understand something. By the time I got to Vietnam, I had been in the Army since I'm 19, and I'm now 22, almost 23.
Yeah.
And so you've got several years of training. Plus, I'd served a year in Thailand as a medic in the 46 Special Forces Company, working with Thai National Police and the Thai Army. So I learned a lot of things in that year. So when I got to Vietnam, I was not combat experienced, but I had a lot of, going in on helicopters. I had other things working in Thailand. So you're well trained, and I will tell you, the Army. I don't think, given the period of the time in history, I don't think the Army could have trained me any better than it did. First off, I don't think the technology that we had, they could have trained me any better.
Right.
And I think you're going in focused on what you're responsible for. My task was basically, I'm along for the ride until somebody gets hurt.
When they get hurt, you kick into gear.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then you focus. But that doesn't mean you're ignoring what's going on around you, because obviously I'm not.
Right.
But I'm not concerned about that machine gun fire or those rifles fire or the mortars coming in. That's not my concern. That's what those other guys, the other 15 guys were concerned with, and the other 120.
Troops, yeah.
Well,
you're focused on
Cooch,
tourniquets.
the other 119, because the one Montagnard was with me, and that was Cooch, and God bless
that's
that.
right. Yes.
I wish we could find him.
Yeah.
I love that little guy.
And just for a side note, Koosh was your Montagnard who you were training to be a medic.
He was a medic. He'd been a medic, and the main thing Cooch did was he watched my back
all the time you're on the ground in Laos.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And he watched my back on the previous operation I was on. So Iota, but he also carried the medical supplies. He also helped with the wounded. It wasn't just me helping with the wounded, right?
Of course.
When I would pull in some people from the line to help carry the wounded and then change them out periodically, because if you've got some guy strapped to a bamboo pole with rappelling ropes and a poncho, and they look like like, have you ever seen those pictures in the distance where you see some guy two guys carrying a tiger?
Yeah.
That's basically what it looked like. And if you ever try it, you're carrying dead weight. Now, Montagnard, probably, most of them weighed somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds. But that's dead weight. And if you're trying to go through that jungle in Laos, I'm going to tell you, I'm not so sure you could drive through there with a bulldozer.
Well, and also, within the next day, you had at least two of the indigenous troops that were killed or died from the wounds, and that you tried to carry them for another day. Then they finally had to make a very difficult decision.
Yeah. We had 3 killed, and I'm the one who made the decision, who gave the order to leave them.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that there isn't a day go by for the last 50 years that I know everybody's told me, consciously I know, but there's something in the back of my head that what I did that day, or actually 2 different days, was wrong, because we left them. They were dead. I don't know if they were Buddhists. I don't know if they were Catholic, because Montagnards were either Catholic or Buddhist.
Right.
So they didn't come home to their families. They didn't get their ritual, or religious, I should say, burial. Their bones are probably scattered to the 4 winds. They'll never probably be found. They don't have a final resting place. And I don't know their names. I know very little about them, except that I'm the one who gave the order that said they're just not coming home.
Right. And you had to do that in order to keep those alive, to be able to move more proficiently in that jungle with triple canopy on top.
Well, we were struggling to carry the wounded.
Right.
I mean, you can't carry we didn't have litters, so we improvised with the pulp bamboo.
Sure.
And when you're carrying basically resting 75 pounds on one shoulder, plus your rucksack and your weapon and everything else, and if you ever got to walk through that part of the world, even if you were stripped down with nothing, it's extremely difficult to move through that type of terrain.
Yeah, and added to that difficulty was Captain McCarley at that time decided specifically that they would move at night, and that meant they had air cover, and so after that round went off, everybody, you patched people up to the point, people were on stretchers, and then once you said everybody's up and running, then they moved at night. And
Well, the mountain yard lieutenant was the worst. He was split from his hip
wow.
all right down to his femur to his knee on the. I'm trying to think. The right leg.
Yeah.
And the thing that saved his life was, fortunately for him, considering that really devastating wound, that it did not cut into the femoral artery.
Oh yeah.
But he still lost a lot of blood.
Sure.
But and one of the things that they talk about, people think I did it deliberately, but I didn't. It was Mother Nature. Flies got into the wound, and
As a result,
all the badly wounded all had maggots in their wounds. I mean, lots.
so we
lots.
literally had maggots coming to the aid of a Green Beret medic to help those wounded.
Right, because they were eating the dead flesh, which
Yeah.
meant they didn't get infection.
Yes.
And
Who would have thought of that?
not me.
No.
And in fact, when we got the one guy back to the 74th back, the surgeon opened up the bandages and looked down and said, he just put the bandages back, says, they're doing a better job than I could.
No kidding.
And well, because they do, they get in there and eat all the dead flesh.
Sure.
Fortunately, they weren't like a blowfly magnet that eats everything.
Right.
But these maggots were just eating the dead flesh, and they relatively kept the wound clean.
Yeah.
My biggest problem with them, though, was I couldn't change the bandages after I bandaged them. And the reason for it is every time in that type of environment, you start pulling bandages off, you start disturbing stuff.
Yeah.
So what I did,
Interrupting the healing process going on.
well, what I was concerned about was starting bleeding again once I got the bleeding start.
Right.
So what I did was I just kept, as the bandages got soaked in blood, I just kept putting more bandages on it. And then on night, or when I could, I got an IV in them to keep them hydrated.
Right.
And then fortunately they didn't have gut wounds, and we could feed them water to keep as much fluids in them as possible. And that was the other concern I had with my really badly wounded, was that dehydration.
Oh yeah.
Blood loss, plus you're sweating like a...
Yeah, in the jungle.
Yeah,
And they're moving.
and you could lose some water, through sweat. So that was my biggest concern, was keeping them hydrated and making sure they didn't start to bleed again. And I gave them just enough morphine, not to kill the pain, but because I gotta believe, bouncing around like we were bouncing them, it had to hurt. They had to be absolutely miserable.
I can't imagine. So like by the end of that first night and into the morning of the second day on the ground, by that time, 9 of the 16 Green Berets had been wounded. And at that point, you and Kalk were working, how do you say it, coach?
Cooch.
Cooch, thank you.
Cooch.
You and Cooch had worked tirelessly on the wounds all night as they moved through the jungle in the dark. But I just wanted to have a quick moment, because you and I talked earlier off camera. It was one of those little moments in time. The first day where you had been on the ground for maybe an hour, they came to a cache, an enemy cache supply site, and it turned out to be some kind of a way station for the North Vietnamese army. And while they were in it, what was it? What was the exact configuration of that?
We think it was probably like a core logistics
Center.
It had Class A phones. By that, if you don't know what a Class A phone is, it's like the thing that's in your home.
Yes.
It had, some of the areas had some wooden sidewalks. They were structures that weren't, by our standards, I guess they would be considered temporary, but they were more, the structures were more secure or sturdy than a simple, build it in a half an hour kind of
And so here you have one of these moments in time where one of those phones rang.
Yes.
And Captain Gene McCraw, it's in the book, but I never knew it was Gene. And so what happened when the phone rang?
Well, I'm standing there because I heard him say this, and he said, the phone rang, he picks it up, he says, Captain Eugene McCarley's 5th Special Forces Group, how may I help you? And I'm going, oh, can I say, I can't say.
You can. Yes, this is Jocko's world.
Yeah. I said, oh, shit, fuck me. I mean, why don't we just carry up, break out the colors, guys, unsheath the colors, It's like, I mean, but we go in sterile and all that, but it's like making a movie and not identifying the actor who's playing a particular character, and that's Matt Damon or Cary Grant or John Wayne, you know who it is.
Because that was part of the Secret War, was our government had entered an agreement somewhere, a treaty or something, with the North Vietnamese. They said, we will not have combat troops in Laos. We said, we won't. We pulled them all out. And the NVA, being the honorable communists they are, added more. And so there was always that secret war. We were there. They didn't acknowledge that they were there, but we knew they were. And that was part of the war. So here's the phone. He answers it.
And I want to dispel something else that has come up, is there were no civilians in that area. There was no evidence of farming. There was no evidence of any kind of civil action at all in that area.
That's why we'll talk about that later on. So why that issue became central later, like 30 years later.
Yeah, I mean, it was a combat area, unbeknownst to most of the world, but it was not a safe place to be. And I can tell you, farmers are not going to be trying to raise rice or pigs or chickens or whatever if you're dropping bombs and mortars and whatever else on them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's because it isn't worth the effort. So what you're going to do is you move off to what you consider a safer area, and so I can tell you, as a matter of fact, I saw absolutely zero evidence of civilization other than that logistics center that the North Vietnamese had built. And that area also had, must have been a way station for troops heading south too, because there was actually a post office there.
No kidding.
We actually got mail, first class mail. I mean, we're talking letters home with a stamp.
And this is the first command post that you hit. You take the intelligence, and then when you all moved out, the engineers set everything up to blow it up, destroy it. Over 9 tons of rice and weapons. Yeah,
and then also we definitely identified the area, and I understand that the Air Force came in and just blew the daylights.
They followed your smoke from where to.
Yeah, they came in, and I understand. I don't know what they hit it with, but they worked that area, and I understand there was, I don't know what the length of time, but there were secondary and tertiary explosions going on. So. Oh yeah,
for several hours.
Yes.
That shows you how deep the supply routes were and the lines were there. That was a major impact on day one.
And so I'm sure we irritated somebody, and that's when I think they started pulling troops off of. The CIA operation was the northwest of Chavano, and we were south of Chavano.
Right.
And I think they started pulling troops off of that operation because now this is Mike Rowe's supposition.
Indeed.
I mean, I can't prove this.
Sergeant Rose at the time.
Yeah, Sergeant Rose. Well, and actually, it's an old man Rose thinking back. We probably had created a thought process in the NBA that this may have been a major U.S. incursion into Laos, which it wasn't. But if a small group creates a lot of havoc, and you're in that environment, you don't have the satellites, you don't have all the.
No, back in those days, no satellites.
Yeah, you you didn't have all the electronic,
No night vision, none of that stuff.
nothing like that, and or at least they didn't. So they're probably wondering who's in there doing what. And then with McCarley moving is constantly, because historically we'd go in and we'd create a static position to draw them.
Right. So from a historic perspective, they had done 3 slam operations where Hatchet Force would go in, set up on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and stay permanent. And then after a while, the NVA would hammer him. Gene's response: we will move day and night, so they won't know exactly where you were. So they couldn't muster large forces, at least the first couple of days you're on the ground. But they kept coming at you.
Yeah, exactly. But they couldn't concentrate their troops because they weren't sure where we were, because
Hard to hit a moving target.
Our great commander, Gene McCarley, I mean, later Colonel McCarley, Lieutenant Colonel McCarley, he, the guy, as far as I'm concerned, since April of 1775, he's probably within the top 5 or 10 individuals that have ever commanded an infantry company in the United States military.
I second that notion. He was just heroic.
I mean, and when you consider that, well, you know, if you consider the amount of wounded we had, but we only had 3 KIAs, and considering the damage we did, and our mission was a success, from what I learned 30 some years later,
Indeed.
He just was astoundingly great commander.
Absolutely, no question. And I want to get back to one more personal point of lessons learned by you when you're on the ground. And again, we're just going back to the book. At one point, during an attack on B Company by an NVA force of more than 40 enemy soldiers, the 2 most seriously wounded men that Rose was treating had both of their IV fluid bags shattered and destroyed during a hail of enemy gunfire. And quoting you in the book, "I learned a lesson right there and then," said Rose. "We kept the IVs flowing from low positions, allowing gravity to work, but not high enough for enemy gunfire to destroy them." My God, what a lesson to learn.
You know,
Who would have thought?
you know, you go through all your medical training.
Yeah.
And if
Which is the best in the world.
anybody's either been in a hospital or either as a patient or a visitor and has seen somebody with an IV bag, they always got it hanging on a hook, a foot or 2 feet above their head at least, right?
At least.
And the reason you want gravity to do it is because you don't want to be forcing fluids, creating pressure in your system unnecessarily.
Right.
And so there were a couple times on the IV, I sat on 1 or 2 to force. Sorry, but
Had to force the fluids forward.
yeah, I can see my instructors at Special Forces Medical Training just going ape when they saw what I was doing. And then the other thing I was doing that was a big no-no was I knew I had a limited amount of morphine. And we had the morphine syringe. It looked like a small tube of toothpaste with a long needle.
Yeah, or like today's small super glue. They come in those little tubes with a little...
Yeah, and a very sharp needle, very thin.
Yes.
Well, I would probably use 1 syringe on 3 people and no alcohol swabs.
Oh.
Because those are gone within the first day, trust me.
Yes.
I mean, at that point in time, you're not concerned with, we'll deal with infection later kind of deal. You know, you hope somebody, I mean, this is all hindsight now, but, you know, I'm thinking, well, maybe it's subconscious. I was hoping that none of these guys had some kind of catastrophic disease, you know, because if they did, all of them had it. But we couldn't get resupplied. My God, every time they tried to get a helicopter in, they were shooting them down.
Well, another big factor too was you wanted to get a medevac in to take out the wounded, but you couldn't because even on day 2, the tactical air was even hampered by bad weather. So you couldn't get TAC air in for a while, as well as when you're moving on the ground, and we couldn't get medevacs out. That was one more sidebar you all had to deal with. So you had to continue to move, continue to take care of your wounded, and the numbers grew amongst the wounded because of the ongoing combat as they moved, even at night.
True, and I can tell you to the moxie of the guys that were with us, both the Americans and the Montagnards. A lot of them had wounds or injuries that at that point that if you were here in Huntsville, you'd be calling 911 or at least taking them to the emergency room.
Right.
But you know, you look at it and if it, okay, you're not bleeding too bad.
You're not going to die today.
Just if it, you know, you're not going to die today. You know, if you could get the fragment out or whatever it was, or put a bandage on it, pat them on the butt, give them their rifle, and put them back on the line. Because it was getting desperate as each day come.
Yeah.
And the fourth day had really become beyond desperate.
Well, even let's get back to the third day for a second, because even there they finally did try to get a medevac in, and that on that with the CH-53 again, the Marine Corps CH-53 Delta came in to pick up the wounded. The pilot was Bill Beardall, and they came in. Our Green Beret medic Doc Paget was on that helicopter with Sergeant John Brown, and as the helicopter began to descend into the LZ, you and a couple other people had the most seriously wounded. That lieutenant was with you, and the helicopter, you were just beginning to reach up to hand the lieutenant over to Doc Paget when the tail rotor struck a tree, and as you were lifting the patient up towards Doc, and the chopper suddenly lifted up suddenly, it was lifting up like it took off.
Well,
and you're on the receiving end of that.
After discussing that years later, decades later,
yeah,
I remember I guess it was not a palm tree, but some kind of tree or bamboo, you know, probably about maybe 6 inches in diameter at the base.
Yeah.
And it was in this middle of what looked like an old bomb crater, I think. Because we didn't clear it, and we were in a clearing of sorts.
Yeah, just trying to find a clear spot to get the chopper in to lift out the wounded.
And the guys had chopped most of that down with knives. We didn't have axes, so they were trying to get that thing as low as possible. And I think we think what happened is that particular helicopter, we think, took a hit of some sort. And what happened was when it wasn't a critical hit per se.
Right.
But what happened when it got hit, the rotor swung in and hit that tree that we didn't quite get slow enough.
Yeah.
Because the helicopters, I remember we were in a bowl-like affair as I think about it.
Sure. Yeah.
And he couldn't really set down flat, so the front end was going to be somewhat up against the side of a bomb crater or whatever created that bowl-like effect. And now this is what we think. And so when it got hit with something, and I'm not sure what it was, I think the pilot, for a minute, it jerked, and the thing slightly hit, and the rear rotor hit the very top of the tree. And once you lose a rear rotor or damage it or bend it, my understanding is very difficult to control a helicopter. Sure. So he had no other choice but to lift off and get out of there.
Right.
Because the last thing we needed was a downed helicopter.
On top of everything else.
And then we'd have God knows how many more injured with a crashed helicopter.
Well, then Doc Paget also said that another round had gone through and it hit one of the fuel containers. And so they had fuel or some kind of liquid flowing inside of the helicopter on top of everything else. So that helicopter did get out of there, but you could not get the wounded out.
No.
So you had to go back to the jungle. That helicopter went out. It did an emergency landing.
We kept pushing like this.
Yeah.
Well,
hoping to get somebody.
Nobody can see me on a radio, but pushing up like you're doing above our heads.
Right.
And they were trying to pull them in, but that particular helicopter was really not designed as a medevac per se. So you either had the side door or you had the tailgate.
Yeah.
And we were trying to get them up through the tailgate. I think.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, that's true. That's what Doc said too. And don't forget, there's another sidebar to that. Was as they came in, this is according to the door gunner, Larry Groh, and he had his M60 and a 51 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun opened up on the helicopter. And he was able to, he said, quote, it was only 25 yards from it. And he opened up with it with his M60 and held it down on full automatic until the 51 was silenced. And that was also going on in addition to all the other activity at that moment in time.
Yeah, this was a great idea that from the very beginning started going bad. And I
Attempt to do the right thing.
And I give great credit to that crew because they got that helicopter. Because the last thing, like I said, is that had pancaked in with all and I did not know about the fuel until you just told me about that.
Yeah.
Now that I remember reading the book, okay. But anyway, I'm getting old, guys. Things don't.
You're not 29 anymore.
Not 22 anymore either. But you have to give great credit for them because they had enough sense to know. And this is what I'm thinking. We did not need that to hit that where we were because we would have taken casualties on the ground, plus the casualties and then we would have struggled with trying to get them out of the helicopter. Plus, if he hadn't silenced that weapon, which we would have had the additional problem with that weapon going at us.
Right.
And our handfuls are in. And you never know on a helicopter crash, everybody could get killed or everybody can walk away from it or something in between. But my biggest fear now that I think about the fuel issue is on that thing. If it had exploded in that bowl, it would have taken, that mission would have been over then.
Right there.
So the pilot, especially the crew, got that up and got it away. And I don't know how far they got before they crashed, but
I forget the exact day, but he got far enough away so that the enemy wasn't firing when they did an emergency landing. And then another helicopter came in, lifted him out on the ladder. And then Doc led the people up the ladder, and then the helicopter took off. There's that iconic photo of the CH-53 Delta flying east with Doc and the other members of that helicopter crew that went down on it. And he and Brown were on that ladder.
Yeah. And it's just
amazing.
It's just amazing. And the attempt that Doc Pageant and Doc Brown coming in to make that attempt like that was probably if they had sat down and really thought about it.
Yeah.
The thought probably would have crossed their mind. This is probably not a good idea.
Because you guys have been drawing intense fire. By that time, this is day 3 now.
Yeah, by then they pretty much, they probably didn't know, they didn't really know exactly where we were till day 4, but by then they pretty much knew the general area we were in.
Right. And so the mission had been planned to go for 5 or 7 days, but on day 4 in the morning, the very first briefing in Da Nang, which is before anybody on the ground knew this, the people that were briefing was that the weather was closing in and would make it impossible for TAC Air to support Operation Tailwind. Also, the NDA were closing in. And so in that morning, everything changed. But also, you also had another intelligence coup during that morning. They hit another command post, get the intelligence. There's firefights along the way. Just an amazing day. And you, meanwhile, are tending to the increasing number of wounded. You and Cooch are moving on, taking care of your men. And this is day 4. And
I want to say something else.
Please.
Too. If we had come across, I know this for a fact, if we had come across NDA wounded, 1, we would not have heard them.
Right.
And 2, with being as conservative as I would have been, I would have, if they were still alive, I would have tried to do something to keep them going long enough for their own people to pick them up.
Right.
And because I guess my attitude was that once they're down,
yeah,
they're down. And, and they probably wanted to be home just as much as the rest of us wanted to be home.
That's the difference between our Army Green Berets and the communists. Because we had many situations, we had wounded personnel, and they would just come along and summarily execute them.
Well, on my first mission, in June of that year, the most severely wounded person I had was an NVA.
Is that right?
Yeah. I did everything to save his life. I left him he passed away. I had put an IV in him. I had given him morphine, and I'd had
The syringe in the collar.
And I wrote a note in English, told him what I'd done, and left him with them.
Yeah, because in the syringe, you do that in the collar, so that anybody that picks them up knows that they've had morphine.
Yeah,
that would impact the triaging and their treatment.
yeah, exactly. And you don't want to give them more morphine than necessary.
Right.
I mean, you don't want to make an addict out of them, but you can kill people with overdosing with morphine. Well, it's a drug. It's
Well, how many times you heard about people that were gut shot and they're on morphine? They're going, "Oh, look at my guts hanging out." We've heard stories like that. It's just amazing. People never think about that aspect of being wounded in combat.
Well, my philosophy in combat, as far as in the field, I never would give anybody a morphine to kill the pain. I would give them enough morphine so they could tolerate it.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. If they can tolerate the pain, then you can talk to them. You can reassure them. And you can also, if they're out because you gave them so much morphine, then any other sign or symptom that may pop up, is probably not going to make an appearance that you'd like to do something else or whatever you could within your poor abilities. So, and the other thing too is, if you get them medevaced out of the field back to say like the 74th back, I think
Right,
it was.
sure.
In,
Play-Q? Yeah.
Then they could, if the guy's conscious enough to be, even though he's a little groggy, you can talk to him. They can talk to him. You know?
Critical.
Yeah, and then they can get more reassurance, especially because if you're giving somebody morphine in the field, they're probably got a pretty serious injury. And in the serious injuries in combat, the first thought one of the biggest things you have with is shock. If they go into shock, you can lose them.
Right.
And you want to keep them out of shock. And they can go into shock even if they're doped up on morphine. So you don't want them so doped up that you can't monitor shock. At least that was my philosophy.
Sure.
And I had learned that from an old Special Forces medic when I was going through training.
Oh, is that right?
It may be anecdotal.
Right.
It may be somebody could maybe challenge me on that technically. Okay. But that was my philosophy, and that's the way I was going to operate.
And it's the way it worked in the field. You brought people back alive.
And it worked on that operation.
Right.
Nobody was so, because when we were carrying those two guys that couldn't walk at all.
Sure.
You could hear them boom, when we bump them or something.
Oh, yeah.
So I knew this sounds terrible. As long as I heard them ooping or ouch or ooh, I knew they were alive.
They're still with us.
They were still with us. And I mean, that's somewhat of I learned that not from school, but I learned it from other medics, older medics that had been around for a while. E7s
Sure.
and E8s that had, because even though I would graduate from Special Forces, had been in Thailand, I still worked with medics that had more experience than I do.
Combat experience.
And you listen to them, because the last thing you want to do is you want to further injure somebody that's already in a tight spot.
Hurt for certain.
Yeah, and especially in a situation where it's not like you can call 911 and an ambulance is going to show up. Because you don't know. In my situation after the first day, we never really attempted to medevac the wounded because that second day with trying to evacuate them proved to be a disaster. So we didn't want to put another helicopter in danger. We didn't want to put more crew in danger. And plus the fact to medevac that many wounded at that point, you've got to have more assets than in the air.
And they were having trouble with the weather even that day.
Yeah, so
Sure.
it wasn't just, I mean, you got to think beyond, sometimes you have to make hard decisions. Fortunately for me, I'm not the one making this. I never made the decision about no more medevacs. That was not my purview. But in hindsight, it was the right decision. It was common sense.
Sure.
I mean, I don't want to see Brown or Pageant hurt or that crew hurt.
Right.
Like they almost did anyway.
Yeah, and so that rescue was on the third day, and so now day 4. So the teams inserted September 11th. We go through the 12th, the 13th, day and night combat, moving, always combat. During the night, they even used tactical air at night. We had Spectres, Sting, and then other gunships that provided cover so that Captain McCarley or his combo man could direct airstrikes on the enemy as they're attacking your positions at night while you're on the move. Meanwhile, you and Cooch are taking care of the wounded as you move. And
I could tell you this much.
Yeah.
Anything you tell me about McCarley, I don't know firsthand because I saw McCarley. And here's the great thing about how great a commander he was. If I can step aside.
Oh, yeah.
Even with all the stuff he was doing, he wasn't eating, he wasn't sleeping, and he drinking whatever that water we could fetch out of the places we were dipping in canteens. He would come by, not all the time, but periodically, a couple, 3 times maybe. I don't know. I can't remember. Yeah. It could have been 1, it could have been 5. I don't know.
But the fact of the matter is,
he came by. And
he's fighting this whole thing. He comes to you.
He comes to me, and he asked me how I'm doing. He wasn't asking how Sergeant Rose, the medic, was doing. He was asking how Mike Rose was doing.
Yeah. The man on the ground.
And I know, talking to other people, that he was doing that with the other guys.
Yeah.
And that included the Mountaineerds too.
Yeah.
You know, you couldn't talk to him, but he could walk by and, pat him on the shoulder. Or,
he had a couple of words in Montagnardese that he could lay on.
Yeah. And the same thing with Morris Adair.
Oh, yeah, the first sergeant.
The first sergeant. It would be remiss in not mentioning him in the same attitude. He was walking around doing his first sergeant stuff, like making sure distribution of ammo or whatever. But he would come by and he would chit-chat with me. Like we were in Central Park.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't stop me from doing what I was doing, but he would just chit-chat. And I know what he was doing. He was just there. I knew he had my back.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
And they all knew, all the men that talked to later, also they knew what you were doing, which was patching them up, as well as the indigenous troops who by that time we had over 50 casualties that you and Coach are looking after, maintaining, helping, as well as moving at the same time.
Oh, I can tell you, the things Cooch and I were doing were probably violating every sanitary medical procedure that I'd ever been taught in training. But at that point in time, it's like, and then plus by day 4 we were out of stuff.
Right.
I thank God that nobody really got really badly hurt on the 4th day.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have any morphine left. I mean, because one of the things that I did with the Americans, everybody's left front pocket belonged to me.
Right. Because,
I made sure they had extra morphine in there, a bandage in there, and I made everyone in their rucksack carry the big belly bandages.
sure, yeah.
And everybody carry an IV bottle. And
And that helps sustain you through those 4 days on the
so
ground.
I would go and pull that stuff from them, or Cooch would go and get it. You know,
Sure.
and because I couldn't carry all that stuff, Cooch couldn't carry all that stuff. And the guys didn't have any problems with carrying that stuff.
Right.
Because if they went down, they knew that
They would need
that would be needed.
it.
Yeah.
So let us turn to day 4 because, and it's funny because, again, the troops on the ground, Captain McCarley and the men, his command element, didn't have a accurate weather picture yet. But they started in the morning and then they hit another command headquarters. They go in, seize more documents. There's combat there. And trying to think. And in addition to intelligence documents, papers, code books, transportation logs, records, North Vietnamese currency, and photographs, including a photograph of Ho Chi Minh, who had been the head of the communists in North Vietnam, who died in 1968. But again, they got this another intel coup. The guys had to pack this stuff and carry it in addition to everything else while engaged in the enemy. On this occasion, they again used as they wired the area, the weapons and the cache site with rice, weapons, enemy supplies, ignited as they pulled out, continuing to move. And when it explodes, then the Air Force came back using that as a marker to completely destroy all the enemy supplies, the cache, which were significant numbers.
You know what really amazes me is dried rice. You don't think about it, but it'll burn pretty good. If you get it ignited. Like if you have a cache of rice, you throw a thermite grenade in there, or put a little gasoline in there.
Yeah.
It'll. I don't know if it'll completely destroy it, but it'll make it unusable. You can't eat it.
Right.
That's all you're interested in.
A little name pop can go a long way with rice.
Yep. So, but if you on rice, if you're cooking rice at the house and you forget about it on the stove and the water all boils out, it'll start to burn.
Right.
You can imagine what, really thoroughly dried rice that's never been in water do. It's like any other dried piece of vegetation will burn. I mean, that's a big challenge with wheat silos in the United States. Is if you're not careful with that, they can be launched into outer space.
That's right. There have been some horrific
Explosions
because of that.
Yeah, so you never know. Well, rice flour, or wheat flour is very dangerous because it burns so quick it's almost like an explosion.
Right. And so getting back to day 4, finally Gene was told about the weather and the air assets started to come out. Joe Driscoll was there with Scarface and they came out to give some support. And then later we had Tom Stump, who was a pilot with an A-1 Skyraider. And Joe, and they thought there was over 1,000 NVA and Pathet Lao troops who were moving towards Company B in the morning. Now, Gene didn't know the numbers were that big, but they knew the enemy was coming. They told him. And Joe Driscoll looked in and he said, during that final briefing, it was very clear. Today was do or die. The big thing was the stark seriousness of the moment. Everyone knew they had suffered heavy casualties, as you knew firsthand, and now the weather was closing in on them. And the A-1 Skyraider pilot, Tom Stump, had added, the weather was dog shit. When we took off, I wasn't optimistic about getting them out of there. And that's what you all were up against on the ground on day 4.
I was later told that I don't know who Tom was talking to over the radio.
Eventually,
he flat said to somebody, and I don't know who he was talking to over the radio.
Yeah.
If we don't get them out now, we're not getting them out.
And he played a key role in protecting you all because at one point the NVA were coming up with some wave attacks. Covey had left, but Gene McCarley was able to talk to Tom Stump, who found a way through the clouds and then made several gun runs that broke the back
I
on
was
those attacks.
told, like I said this morning at breakfast, that the A1E pilots were told not to fly under 500 feet. And I don't know if that was a standard order or whatever. But later on, I found out it was Tom Stump. But he made a pass over us. And the way the 50 calibers operate, this is why for years I thought Tom was taking hits. And what it was the rounds come up and the prop bar pushes the rounds back up, the spent cartridges.
Yes, indeed.
So what I was seeing was the shadowing of those 50 caliber rounds along his fuselage. But when he turned and looked down, I couldn't read it, but I could see that there was lettering on his helmet. That's how low he was.
Really?
And what scared the crap out of me, because at first I thought he was strafing us, but it wasn't. You know what it was? It was the expense 50 caliber. And I mean, those things were going everywhere when they were hitting the ground. And I suspect they were going, how fast are they going? I don't know. But they're, what, 2-3 inches?
Like a small tube of crest.
Yeah. And it's funny now, but at the time it wasn't. That stuff was going everywhere. I mean, except it never hit a single person got hit with one of those expended rounds. And I don't, you know what? To me, that's why I believe firmly, I am somewhat of a religious man. I'm Catholic. I go attend church and whatever on regular. But when I think back about it, there's little incidents like that say to me, there are guardian angels. There is a divine intervention saying, yeah, nobody's going to get hurt on this. And somehow the good Lord pushed those spent rounds
indeed
in such a way as nobody got hit. Because if you'd got one, they're hot, and two, they're probably traveling a couple hundred miles an hour.
Oh yeah, particularly on a gun run.
Yeah,
because they're coming down. Those birds, those warbirds, those magnificent
and as high as low as he was, I should say.
Well, one of our targets, we had a gun run in the asphalt where the A1 Skyraider pilot, after his gun run, he put the bird on its side to look at me. I could see him, and I could tell you he was smoking a Philly cheroot. And I saluted as he went past. That's how close they were.
Yeah.
It's just like what you're saying.
Yeah, those A1E pilots, man, they're the crazy bunch of guys. And then to keep flying through all that anti-aircraft stuff and the SAMs and everything, it's just...
And I think that one of the keys to their success was the fact that a lot of them flew, where particularly when it came to a gun run or a napalm strike, they flew not from 5,000 feet, but they were much closer to the deck, maybe violating that 500-foot rule too. But we aim to try to get a future SPAD pilot, an A1 pilot on here someday. We're working on that right now for some of our future podcasts.
I've always wondered if that low altitude, some of those anti-aircraft weapons that the NBA had were really not designed to go after. And in that jungle, your quadrant in elevation was limited from the canopy. Where they would put those things, I would suspect. But I don't really think that they were really designed or were operating to go after aircraft that low. And I understand, talking to other people, one of the reasons we didn't lose more Hueys was because a lot of the NBA didn't lead the Huey far enough. They would aim at the Huey.
Right at it.
And by the time the rounds got there, the Huey was already passed. So a lot of, it's like our field artillery, you don't aim at the target. The earth moves and the round spins to the left and the round and the target collide. So, because of the distance involved.
Indeed. So on this day, getting back to day 4, the enemy kept coming. By now, they're rolling into the team. Like you said, they've located where you are. They've just your team has destroyed the enemy headquarters cache site, and you're moving forward. And at some point, the enemy's coming so heavily between the gun runs that in order to break the attack, they came in with CS gas, which is tear gas.
Yeah, it's the same thing that in fact, my understanding, CS was originally developed for use by for police in riot control. Now, it's not a lethal gas.
No.
As long as you're not in a room or something they fill it up with. But CO2 can do the same thing. But I will tell you something. CS is the only cure I know for a common cold or sinus infection.
Get out.
That'll work within minutes, because I tell you what, you get that stuff up in your sinuses. If you have a bacterial infection or a viral infection, those little guys are climbing over each other to get out of your nose. I'm telling you, because that stuff, your eyes, you can't get your eyes open. You feel like you can't breathe.
Yeah.
Your nose begins to run at a massive amount. It's very unpleasant.
Oh God. Well, like Gene McCarley said, one of the reasons why he called in the CS was because they were desperate. The hordes, the NVA hordes, would come into the team, and they hit it with the CS, and that made it possible for the helicopters eventually to land. And Gene had that quote. So we had a lot of our guys crying and choking on that CS, but it also brought them critical time. And so then Scarface, the Cobras made gun runs, and the CH-53, the first one, came in for the first troop pickup. They pick up 1/3 of the force.
Yeah.
They leave.
We got the wounded out on the first one.
Yeah.
Plus I will say, Mountain Yard, I don't know if you want to use the word panic, or they were itching to get out of there.
They were ready to go home.
Well, the thing is, with as many that got on that first helicopter, when you think in hindsight, I'm surprised it got off the ground.
No kidding.
I mean, it was overloaded.
Yeah.
Now, the second one wasn't as overloaded, but it...
and the second one, as it comes in, there's increase, has more gunfire on it, enemy gunfire, than the first one.
And after the second one picked up, they only left about 35 of us on the ground.
Right. 35 out of the original 130, but you went in 133?
So the first two helicopters picked up pretty close to 100 people.
Wow.
And I'm really surprised that helicopters are not known for flying very well in hot weather. They love the Arctic, from what I understand. But,
indeed.
And then we were taking a lot of fire. And then, of course, we're on the line, and I started taking more wounded. Excuse me.
It's okay. Yeah, so now we're down to the third helicopter. Again, Scarface, the Cobras did the gun runs. And then the third CH-53 Delta Marine Corps helicopter comes in to pick up more troops. And so you all are getting on the helicopter, and
Penske's flying.
Yes, indeed. And so on a final approach, and they knew that that this was a last chance to get you all out. And Sergeant Mike Hagan, who was one of the team members, said, "I can tell you that big bird was a welcome sight to us. We were all beat, we were all wounded, and we were all ready to go home. Believe me." And Mike was on that. You, Mike, and a few others were the last, and Gene were the last ones to get on that helicopter.
I got on, and Morris Adair got on, and Gene McCarley was the last member of B
ground.
Company, 5th Special Forces Group, Command and Control Central.
Right.
He was the last man to step off that field.
And even before he stepped off, a few minutes earlier, when he was standing there with a radio operator, Montier standing next to him was killed. Standing right next to him. And then, like Gene said, it was one of those moments in time. The Montagnard was shot in the head. There was blood all over the place.
No, I'm not. I know. I picked. We did. I know. I can't remember if he was killed because I remember we didn't leave anybody on the ground.
No.
I'm not sure if he was killed or he was just. At first, one of them. There were two. There was one I know for sure because I gave my weapon to Pete Landon, and I went forward and grabbed a guy that went down. He got hit in the head, and I'm dragging him back to the ship. I got him on board, and I remember
the one then.
Yeah, I think that's the one. And he was. I mean,
that's even his fellow Montagnard told Gene, him dead. They all thought he was dead, but you're the medic.
But he was. I remember his whole head was just encased. Well, you know how badly your head bleeds.
Head wounds.
Can imagine a round bouncing off from the front of yours all the way back, and it looked like the thing. I don't know what he got hit with, but the track was as I remember, it looked like it was about a half an inch. Skin and hair and everything was missing.
Oh wow!
And he was his whole head was encased in blood. So we threw him on the helicopter. But he didn't die. And I think, and you know, when you talk about that, I read that and I'm thinking, no, because
that's one point we never asked you about.
The third one was killed when we went down after the extraction.
Right.
And he somehow got crushed with the helicopter. So there was a third one left at the crash site. The two we left on the second day.
Right.
And that fourth one that was so badly hurt, which was the last guy.
Yeah.
He made it back. He was alive. I don't know how.
That's amazing.
I don't know how well he made it, how well he was afterwards.
But you got him back and he was still breathing when you got him back.
Yeah, he was still breathing when we got back to Jocko.
Yeah.
And then there was the Marine, and he was a bloody mess.
Let me just set the scene for a second through Tom's stump, because Tom again is in the A1, looking down. It was a wild scene down there as we provided close cover to the team on the ground. Air Force F-4s attacked anti-aircraft guns that the NVA had moved into the area. They, the NVA, really wanted them. They were massed to get them. They wanted to get back what the team had taken from the base camp. Covey riders told us that the NVA 12.75, a Mike and a 37 Mike anti-aircraft weapons were opening up on us. Meanwhile, Scarface Cobra gunships reacted to enemy gunfire on their position while Gene directed them towards the enemy troops. So things on the ground, even before you get on that helicopter, were just crazy.
Yeah, and if you were to make if I made a statement and you disagreed with it, right, and you were on the ground, I can't argue with you.
Yeah.
Because we hadn't slept for 4 days. I don't remember eating. I really don't remember eating. Probably did, but I don't remember.
Yeah.
I remember drinking a lot of nasty water. It's like I told somebody once that, you drop your canteen in that water. Well, the water was probably clear until the first guy walked through it.
Right.
It
did. Clear water gets.
And everybody, and then you throw a handful of iodine in there, which tastes like shit.
Oh yeah.
And then you're drinking that stuff and you're spitting stuff out, and you hope what you're spitting out isn't moving on its own.
Indeed.
So we were drinking water. I know we were drinking water because we were fairly hydrated, but because I was checking on that kind of stuff also, and but you were exhausted, and people talk about the fog of war.
Sure.
Yeah, I remember. There's a Hollywood effect that I've seen in movies before, like in a battle scene. And I remember this one battle scene. It was takes place between a British ship and a pirate ship,
right?
And they're firing at each other, and the sound goes dead, and all you see is the effects of stuff blowing up and exploding, but you don't hear any sound. And it's like a fog. You're just kind of...
The fog of war.
Yeah. And that's why I'm saying, am I wrong? I could be. Are you wrong? You could be. But it's probably something in the middle.
Sure. Because you've had combat scenes where two people are fighting and looking the same way and they tell completely different stories. That just happens. And like, can we just turn to what Gene was saying?
Yeah.
At that last moment? Because Gene said, as we were backing up the ramp, up the helicopter ramp, they were coming towards us. They were coming at us hard. I'm guessing the CS guys had them confused because they were getting too close to us as me, Mike, Mars stood, but none of them threw a grenade into the chopper. I never understood why they didn't. They were that close. And they kept coming, even as we lifted off the LZ while mowing down NVA soldiers. God, I just can't imagine.
And you know, want to hear something really silly?
Yeah.
I can remember that at that point, there were only 3 of us on the ground.
Right.
There was the captain, Morris, and myself. I'm looking away from the helicopter, right? I don't remember seeing any NVA.
Is that right?
I don't.
Yeah.
And I remember, I can't remember if it was McCarley or it was probably Morris because he was closer to me. Because McCarley was behind Morris and then I was in front of Morris.
Right.
So it probably was Morris that kind of shoved me or pushed me up the ramp. And Bernie Bright grabbed me I remember him and sitting me down at the top of the ramp.
Yeah.
And I can remember Morris and the colonel coming up the ramp.
Yeah.
But if you were to ask me which one came up first, I can't tell you.
Yeah.
I just remember 2 figures coming at me.
Sure.
I knew they were...
Well, plus they're coming into the darkness of the helicopter from the outside light.
So I don't know which one came out first. And then I'm sitting there, and then it's kind of like... And I'm sure we're taking rounds.
Well, okay, let me help you here, because in the book, Persky, the pilot, and others all said the helicopter was getting hit with rounds. And as you said, you sat down, and as the helicopter began to lift off, Marine Sergeant Stevens was bleeding profusely from a gunshot wound in the neck. And you then treated him. As the helicopter's taking off, could you explain it better to me today than we did in the book? The round went through his neck. And then at some point, here's another thing from the medics that your medic perspective that I really enjoyed of all the points was you were trying to treat him and you could tell that he was very lucky. I'm quoting you now, Mike. He was very lucky. The round had missed the carotid artery and the trachea, yet he was going into shock. I rolled him over, got him on all fours. And I remember telling him, listen, you lucky son of a bitch, if you're going to die, you'd be dead by now.
I didn't use the word lucky. I think I said, listen, you stupid son of a bitch. If you were going to die, you'd be dead by now. I think I used the word stupid, but you know what?
Yeah. But it worked.
But it worked. He came out of shock.
Yes.
And
he began to bounce back.
And that's all I did. I mean, and I remember.
What do you do to stem the bleeding from a neck?
I wasn't worried about that.
Sides?
You know what I was worried about?
No, what?
If he had hit anything, I knew if he'd hit anything vital.
Right.
He would have been dead by the time he hit the ground. Because you hit those carotids.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you bleed out probably, 10 seconds?
Quick.
Something like that. I was worried about his head bobbing. Because if you can't, his muscle damage was, and he probably couldn't hold his head. So, and don't ask me what I wrapped his neck in.
I won't.
Because I can't tell you. I think it either had to be shirt sleeves or kerchiefs or, that.
Well, to quote Mike Rose, Then I found something to wrap around the neck to get the bleeding to stop. That's what you did. Something.
I did something. I don't remember what it was, but I stabilized his head so it wasn't moving. And then the next thing I know, I'm sitting on a beach.
Well, wait. Because you're forgetting just a little bit more of the drama here on day 4. As you're repairing Sergeant Stevens' neck, the helicopter's rising over a mountaintop, and one of the 2 engines goes out. Now, you may not be aware of this because you're busy with Sergeant Stevens and the troops are there looking at the mountains you're flying over. And then they were well aware of the danger. And of course, the pilot, I guess it would be Lieutenant Persky, he said that ridge line was sheer granite. And he was scared about crashing into that granite. They finally get over one more mountaintop.
Oh, now you tell me. Yeah, I didn't need to know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so, I mean, it's in the book. Yeah, I know.
Oh, indeed.
But I'm going, oh, crap.
Yeah. And so the second engine goes out. And
I should have never read the book.
That's right. Well, I put pictures in it.
Yeah.
And so as they got over the second granite ridge line, it had flown over. Now the big warbird was struggling. There were hydraulic fluids and blood everywhere inside the helicopter, according to Rose. And the tail was lower than it should be. We could tell something was wrong, really wrong. We just didn't know how wrong. And so the second engine goes out. And then there's that moment in time where he's descending. He's into auto rotation. Auto rotation is when the helicopter, the weight and the air moves the propeller enough so that they don't crash, but it's definitely going down with the controlled descent to its extent. And he put out a call, Mayday, Mayday. And he said, normally people would come back and say, hey, you can see an LZ or you'd go here. There was complete radio silence. So he looked for an area as he's descending, and it's an area that he'd never trained in. Training with a CH-53 Delta, loaded with troops, intelligence information, bleeding Marines, and they're auto-rotating in. And so it lands, so finally it has a very harsh landing.
And there's a problem?
Yeah, Mike, we have just a little issue here.
Yeah.
The 2 engines are out. You're
the inboard mechanic should have solved that, right?
Yeah, should have fixed it. Was he slacking?
Yeah, it must have been taking a nap. But here's another perspective on that scenario.
Please.
When I got up and Bernie sat me down, right? We were lifting up, and he was struggling because he lost one engine going in, and there was hydraulic fluid. Stuff was obviously because there was water, or I probably thought it was water. I don't know what it was, all over the floor, and I remember the tail going like this up and down, and I could see green and then blue and then green. And I don't know which one of us said this. And Bernie and Bright and I to this day can't tell you. One of us said, we're going to crash. And the other one said, yeah, I know. And we were arm in arm, figuring, bend over and kiss you know what, goodbye. And that's when I got tapped on the shoulder. Now, you can't believe this. There was a Marine captain.
No.
Starch fatigues. Spit shine boots.
No.
Looked like he was getting ready to take a photo op for a Marine Corps recruiting poster.
Indeed.
And he said, I got a wound in the back. So I got it and went back there.
Yeah.
And I remember that that's one thing that stuck in my head. And it's like, we all look like shit.
Yeah, you're sweaty, bloody, CS.
Any no offense to officers and colonels, but if any colonel had seen any of us, we would have been court-martialed for our lack of military equipment and dress, right? But I mean, it was the funny things that stick in your head. I remember him. I can't remember his face or what his name is, but I remember him. And what he was doing was he had a headset on, and he was controlling or talking to the pilot about what was going on the ground from what he could see from the tailgate.
Yeah, sure.
Because he had already, normally when a helicopter comes down, then they drop the ramp. But when he was coming down, he had already fully dropped the ramp.
Really?
Right.
Huh.
Because I don't think there would have been time to hit the ground and drop the ramp. Because as soon as those, and I got to believe, I have to believe that the first two pilots that came down also had dropped the ramp. And I don't know if that's according to Hoyle or what. But there was literally no time, I think, because when you see those ramps come down,
yeah,
the ramp comes down like this.
Right.
You got to stand there and wait.
But
and I don't think they wanted us to wait. They were trying to get us out, so they dropped. So I think that Marine captain was controlling or keeping. He was the eyes and the ears of the pilot, focusing back,
right,
looking at what's going on.
Well, also,
and he was probably waiting for us to get up, and he'd say, "Okay, pull the ramp up." But guess what? The ramp never came up.
No hydraulics.
No hydraulics.
And Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Mel Swanson observed that helicopter descending into the canyon. And this was his impression. It was a kind of a depression he headed towards. The helicopter was trailing smoke. It was ugly, real ugly. I worried that it might explode in midair, or worse, hit one of those granite mountains in the jungle. From my seat in the old trusty A1 Skyraider, I couldn't see any LZ, or any area that was open large enough for those Marines to land that big bird without crashing. And by now, I had heard they were auto-rotating with a chopper full of troops. It didn't look good. It impacted on a side angle in Laos, and it appeared to be a sandy beach with some water around it. But you didn't see that.
A creek or a river.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know what.
Yeah.
It wasn't a lake.
When that helicopter hit with sudden impact, forceful impact, so much so that Gene's teeth were crushed.
14 teeth, right down to the roots, were gone.
Oh, my God.
Well, that's the count I found out later.
Yeah, of course.
And, but by the way, I should tell you, that Marine Corps and I were not on the helicopter when it crashed.
Okay, where were you? I'll bite.
We were already on the ground.
How'd that happen?
Apparently, one of the pilots said he saw two bodies go up. There's two 50-gallon gun ports.
Right, sure.
On the front.
Yeah.
If you see that picture of me with the two beers and Thomas
Yeah.
and Spurgeon on both sides of me.
Right.
If you take a real good look, there's a scab right here. What is it? You can see it when I.
Okay.
Okay, when I crank, there's a crease here.
Yeah, sure. You still got it.
Yeah. Well, when that rolled, the two of us went this way, and when it went this way, apparently we were at the right angle to go out the door. And we were told that they don't know how many feet. I've heard 50 feet, I've heard 20 feet, but the two of us were thrown out of the helicopter and hit the beach.
Whoa. Had it not been sand, you would have been dead.
Yeah, but whatever.
Yeah, whatever.
Then again, when I say if people don't believe it, anybody who was on that operation, whether you're in the air or the ground, if you don't believe in God,
Yeah.
you're a fool. And I sincerely believe that, because this shouldn't happen. Especially the Marines survived another 42 years.
Yes.
So all I remember is sitting there like with my hands back. Now this is what now at this point in time, I can just get little vignettes of like shadows.
Sure.
Like I'm sitting there and this blob is coming at me. And I don't know if it stopped 10 feet, 20 feet, 5 feet, a foot. I have no clue.
Right, because your vision's still off.
I'm off. You know?
Yeah.
My bell has been rung.
Big time.
So I get up and I turn and look at the helicopter. Now, how the hell McCarley got out of that helicopter, I don't know. I'm not sure how. Morris is taking a bath in the river.
Right, we'll get to that in a second.
I walked up to McCarley and I looked at him and said, we got to get back. This is what McCarley's telling me. I told him. I don't remember doing this.
No kidding.
But McCarley tells me
Yeah.
that I walked up to him and he says, I said, we got to get back on that helicopter. There's guys on there.
Right.
So he, later he said, yeah, it was.
He did say that too, sure.
And I mean, he told me later, he said, you know, when I think about it now, it was really not one of the brightest decisions I made to follow you on that burning helicopter.
Burning helicopter at that.
Yeah. So we start, and the reason I know that helicopter was tipsy-turvy is because all the people were at the bottom and there was equipment piled.
On top
Bernie
of-
Bright was buried up to his waist in rucksacks and rifles and
Right.
stuff from the aircraft.
All the intel reports you brought back and photos and
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
And the only thing sticking out of that mess was his feet.
No.
Yeah, and he's kicking like crazy. I can remember that. So we start throwing stuff. Now, Planchet crawled out somehow.
Right.
He doesn't remember how he got out. I don't remember him. I don't even know he's there in the hole. We know it wasn't the door.
Right.
It was a hole in the side of the aircraft.
Wow, no kidding.
It had to be
Yeah.
because of the way the helicopter was sitting on the ground.
It was cockeyed.
Yeah.
Big time.
So I'm throwing stuff out, and every time I throw stuff up, I'm hitting him in the head. We started passing anybody that was in there out. And as they got on the ground, they kind of shook, well, come over, help, help, help.
Yeah.
So we're pulling, and then I remember going forward and helping the pilots out of the. I remember going forward.
The pilot's compartment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I remember going forward that far, and I remember being with the pilots, but I can't remember if I helped them out or if
Go ahead, keep going.
we got them going, right? Or they got out on their own. But one of them, or both of them, used their infantrymen to try to create a perimeter, which a lot of good that would have done. We figured we had about 20 rounds left between all of us. Not to mention, rifles had been really stirred up.
Sure.
Handguards were missing, they were broken and everything else.
On impact.
Yeah. So the next thing I know is there's a helicopter. Now this is what I remember.
Sure.
I'm on the helicopter. I don't remember getting off. I don't remember getting the ground. I remember somebody saying everybody's clear or empty or
Right.
something, indicating to me that there was nobody left in. We weren't going back in for any equipment. Then the next thing I know is the helicopter backs into the beach, and everybody, we shuffled them onto everybody.
Yeah, another helicopter came in.
The fourth one that should have been ours.
Yeah.
And if that third one had gone down in that LZ, it would have been over with.
Oh, yeah.
So
No question.
we shuffled people in, and we get the ride back to Khartoum. I guess.
Yeah.
I remember looking at the helicopter landing, and the next thing I really clearly remember is standing at our launch point there at Jocko.
Mm-hmm.
And then, to really finish off the day, we started taking mortar and artillery fire from that NBA mountain up there.
Where they fired every day on Jocko.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember standing there like an idiot, watching a Cobra, fully armed Cobra, getting hit and blown up. I was like, and then
Welcome home.
yeah. So and the guys were jumping into this. I don't know how it happened. I remember the guys were in a bunker.
Yeah.
We had to help them out. There were so many of them in there they couldn't get out by themselves.
Whoa.
It's like 12 men squeezed into a 6-man box kind of deal. And I remember passing out, kind of.
Yeah.
because they tell me I did. And the next thing I know, I'm almost shirtless because I was so soaked in blood
They thought you were bleeding.
thought I was bleeding, so they were checking me out, but I wasn't. Surprisingly, I had a lot of things in me, but nothing really what I would consider life-threatening or critical. And the next thing I know, the next thing I remember is I'm on a helicopter with a mountain yard and Morris Adair heading back to Pontoon. I don't remember that Huey. I don't remember getting on that Huey. And the first sergeant, Morris Adair, tells me, he said, I looked right at him and he said, if this damn thing crashes, I'm walking back. You know?
Yeah. And
Like-
what you all have been through.
And I get the rest of the afternoon is a complete blur. I remember going and take a shower, and probably the reason I remember I remember I was so filthy and covered in hydraulic fluid and whatever.
Right.
I couldn't get the soap to soak up. You know, it just wouldn't lather.
Yeah.
I think I went through a whole bar of soap before I finally got clean, or what I perceived.
Sure.
And apparently I had taken my uniform and walked to the shower with the towel slung around my waist with shower shoes, taken the shower, and I had thrown my uniform that I had on out in front of my door. And I get back from the shower and I couldn't get anywhere near it. I had to get a stick to move
He
stunk so bad. I think we burned them.
Yes.
And then I remember getting something to eat, and then I remember going to sleep and waking up the next morning, and we had to go to S2 debriefing,
Right.
and then I had the afternoon off, and I think I went back and went to sleep, and then I got up next morning, went back to the dispensary, and started holding sick call.
And so how did all this begin with your Army career? At a 19-year-old, you went in?
Yeah, I was in a North Hollywood, California draft board, and it was an old area. They were really not giving out too many deferments, so I was about to be drafted. So I talked to my father, and he said, you know, based on my experience in World War II, being in the Marine Corps, he said, 1942, he went in. He said, you know, if you're going to join the Marine Corps, that's one thing. But I don't recommend you being a draftee in the Marine Corps. Okay. The Navy's a great service, don't get me wrong, but I'm not really thrilled about saltwater.
Yeah, you and me both.
I'm not, you know. And then, not thrilled about saltwater. And the Air Force, my God, somebody had to look. There was a waiting list to get in the Air Force. I mean, enlisted wise, right? I don't know about pilots, but to be an enlisted man in the Air Force during that time frame. Now we're talking 1967. There was a waiting list a couple of years or something. The Coast Guard was even worse. It was like somebody said it was a 5-year waiting list at that point. Because people were joining them thinking they're going to avoid Vietnam, and
Little did they know.
little did they know. Like how these guys that joined the National Guard and found themselves in Vietnam. Yeah.
Indeed, yeah.
So that's how I ended up in the Army, and I picked the Army because I think it settled me first. And the way I ended up in Special Forces, when I was at AIT Infantry at Fort Gordon, Georgia, I had gone to basic training at Fort Ord, which I understand has been closed years ago.
Yes.
And so I, you know how you're in the Army, and I grew up, this is the 60s. They called me out of formation, told me you're going down and take a test. Okay, written test. So I go down and take this written test. Well, this sergeant comes in with a green beret on, I remember. He's a recruiter at Fort Gordon for Special Forces.
Yes.
And so he said, we want you to take this test. Well, you know, you're a private in the Army and you just do what you're told.
Sure.
My dad said, do the best you can. If they tell you to do something, do it the best you can. He said, if you screw it up, okay, but don't screw it up because you didn't try.
Right.
So I took the test. I didn't think anything of it because I had joined for airborne infantry.
Sure. Unassigned.
Yeah. So at the end of AIT infantry, I get, which I was 11 Charlie mortars, right? I get assigned to jump school, parachute school. And I go at the end of parachute school, I got these orders to go to Fort Bragg. They loaded up, I think, about maybe 10 or 12 of us on a bus and bussed us to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And then I get there and I have to take another series of tests, written tests. And they just come out, well, Rose, you're going to be a medic. I said, okay. It's like,
Yeah.
I don't know if they were a shortage of medics because I never thought I had much of an aptitude for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I went and spent the next year.
See, I knew I couldn't be a medic. I knew my shortcomings. I couldn't do it. But you, on the other hand.
So I spent the next, year and a half?
Sure.
Going through Special Forces. Now it's like, you wouldn't believe the requirements now. It's a
it's still-
2.5-year course now.
And it's still the best medics in the world.
Oh, all special ops, whether you're Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, go to Special Forces medical training at Fort Bragg.
They do.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So anyway, which is great because then you get the benefit of all the services and that medical training and stuff.
Sure.
So anyway, I go through the training and I get assigned the 7th Special Forces Group. Then
A year at the 46th
then
Company Battalion.
I was, yeah,
You survived time with Sergeant Lonnie Holmes.
Yes.
And a few other reprobates.
yeah, a few, Shaw and Weitzel.
Yes.
And so I spent a year in 46 Company, which I think really benefited me greatly because I learned a lot about dealing with tropical diseases and not combat wounds, but you see an axe wound that's week old, it's not been treated.
Ooh.
And
it smells good too.
Oh yes, great.
Ah.
I learned a lot about pediatrics.
Which is critical to any Green Beret medic.
And because people used to bring you children all the time.
All the time.
And then I went to Vietnam to MAXOG and we held my duty. I was in the dispensary every morning, 7 days a week, holding sick call. What really amazes me, there are about 3 or 4 of us and we'd see 300 people between about 7 in the morning and around 11, 12 at noon.
No kidding.
Oh yeah, you got a production line.
Yeah, our sick call wasn't that big. Could they bring some
Well,
family
see, we
in?
were right next to Khartoum, and there was a big,
Yeah.
and we were seeing primarily, we weren't seeing troops.
No.
We saw mostly children and women, or children.
Sure. Yeah.
That's what we were treating for the most.
Domestic stuff that was
It was-
local,
yeah.
indigenous.
And a lot of it was like, I don't know, rashes and pneumonias and whatever. And I think what happened is, they bring their kids in and they get better really quick. So then word gets out, so the next, today you got 10.
Go see Boxy.
Yeah, the next day you got 20, and then the next,
Yeah.
And Khartoum, relatively speaking to Vietnam, the next biggest anything was Pleiku, which was about up 14.
Yeah.
Up 14.
Clicks.
Yeah, 14. No, I mean Highway 14.
Oh, Highway 4, I'm sorry, yes.
I think it was Highway 14. And I don't know.
I was never there at Khartoum.
I don't know. Well, FOB too. There was carved in a big rock there, and I wonder if it's still there. I don't know. But anyway, you saw a lot of that, and then you went to the field, and you came back, and but you saw a lot of, and then of course we did the local houses.
Yes, of course.
We did.
Yes, we use a lot of penicillin.
Yes, exactly. You know, it was amazing on a lot of these people that were, you know, you could use like penicillins on an American,
Right.
and you'd struggle to get that whatever it was because they've had so much penicillins. But a lot of the locals, they'd never had antibiotics,
Right.
and they'd get something, and you give them a shot, man, you could almost, you know, the next day you'd see a noticeable improvement.
Indeed. Well, look, because of our time factor here, I wanted to just mention briefly and not even focus on it. Just to say that 28 years later, the Communist News Network, also known as CNN, came out and they did a fictitious story
On
Tailwind that was slanderous, it was error-ridden, and it was a complete insult to every man that was on it.
I think it was a complete insult to anybody that has served in the U.S. military since April 19th, 1775.
Indeed.
It was disgusting. You know, it's kind of like they should. Well, one of the reporters said, "Well, I saw the launchers, so we know they used poison gas." And my response was, "Well, you know, we had 155 millimeter howitzers and 8-inch howitzers in Vietnam. Both of those weapon systems have a nuclear round, but that doesn't mean we had a nuclear round in Vietnam."
Yeah. And so the fact that we use CS, they turned that around also to make
Make
it
it into GB.
right.
Well, you know, like I said earlier, CS is not a pleasant thing to be around. It's
But
horrible.
it worked on that day and it helped save your bacon.
Right, and maybe, you know, it saved our bacon, but, you know, maybe in a way, how many North Vietnamese troops got so overcome by the gas that weren't?
Yeah, they're disoriented enough that they could not open fire or throw a hand grenade into the CH-53 you guys
Or
were
didn't
boarding.
get as far toward us that maybe they didn't end up getting hurt from the aircraft that was dropping stuff. You know, there's a lot of things you can think about or carry this.
Sure. So the Communist News Network did this piece. Time Magazine repeated the
Yeah, and
error.
they used my fat little face all over the world as the Peter Arnett. And there used to be a New Zealander, I think he's passed away now.
Mhm.
He was in U.S. Army.
Right.
They come to our breakfasts here in Huntsville every month.
Okay.
And he said, the only thing about, when he left New Zealand, we were so glad that he left New Zealand, because he wasn't, even the New Zealanders didn't like Arnett.
So that is case, there was litigation, there were
Yeah.
suits filed.
A lot of people got fired, and a lot of people left the journalism industry, if you will.
Indeed. But more importantly, what I want to move on to was how your life has been impacted ever since October 23rd, 2017, when at the White House, President Donald J. Trump presented you, sir, with the Medal of Honor for your actions during that mission.
The first year was bizarre. I mean, it was like, the phone calls, the letters, you know.
I can't imagine.
And the emails. Starting with the second year, it kind of slowed down. Third year, it's gotten quite a bit. Now, going into the fourth year, because
Did the
I'm
COVID
falling
virus
into
help you
the
a little bit?
history,
Yes.
I am being contacted by mainly legitimate groups
Yes.
that want something. They're not interested in making a profit off of this. And tell you a funny story.
And this is your Medal of Honor you pointed to,
Yeah.
that you received at the White House.
And let me also, I'd like to say something about this medal.
Please.
Any one of those Americans on that operation could have been awarded this medal. It was like the 16 of us drew straws, and I got the short one. Because the actions that everybody, Boudreaux, Smith, were just McCarley, Adair, Orozco, the things that I saw these men do over the period of that 4 days were way beyond what is expected of a member of the United States military. I mean, they're, and then to give credit to the air crews.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Heroic.
I mean,
Day and night.
flying into any aircraft in a kite, basically, is incredible. So the courage that was displayed, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Army, there is nothing but pride and greatness of all the men involved. And I also want to thank, not just the air crews, but those guys that were there, making sure that they could refuel and reload the ammunition on those aircrafts. Because my understanding that the Marine Corps air crews were so exhausted, right?
Right.
That there were cooks and clerks and everybody else, Marines, that were volunteering to fly.
Because they knew the shit was in the fan.
That they didn't care it was Army people in the ground.
No.
But they knew that there was a bunch of Americans down there. If they don't get them out, they're not coming home.
Absolutely.
And literally, we would be among the missing in action.
Yeah.
That flag behind you would be my epithet.
Indeed. And the after that mission, there were how many Purple Hearts awarded to during that day to the Special Forces men on the ground? And
My understanding, the count that I have, and I have not scientifically verified this.
right.
I can tell you there were 24 Purple Hearts for the Special Forces. And my understanding, there was another 12 issued for the air crews
Who were wounded in action.
who were wounded.
Yeah.
So a total of 36. And if all of those mountain yards had been U.S. troops, they would have had the Army Accounting Command would have had to put in another order for Purple Hearts.
Because
There was not a single mountain yard on that operation that had some kind of injury from the.
Yeah, and the other thing that you had was the concern for how many of the indig were wounded. Out of the 120 that went out there, more than 60 were wounded.
Those were the ones that was the number that needed a medics.
Right.
But if you talk about, if you ask how many I saw, I probably saw more than 60 because they'd come by and ask for a Band-Aid or something.
Right.
No, I'm
Sure.
just,
Deadly serious, yeah.
like if you got something here and you want to pat it, so if you're left-handed or right shoulder or whatever,
Sure.
so when you fire your weapon, it's not bouncing up against whatever there. And I can tell you the bruising, the effects of bamboo.
Yeah.
One of the things that with me when I got hit so bad,
Right.
when I got thrown up in the air,
Yeah.
was for a year. First year Margaret and I were married, Margaret spent. She said she hates this, but she said, yeah, I did it. I would get like boils,
From the shrapnel.
she would either pull out a piece of metal or a piece of bamboo. It would finally fester and come up.
Oh, yeah.
And that went on for a year after.
Oh my God. People never think about that. And so moving to something more positive, one of your missions today with the Medal of Honor Society is education program. Let's talk just a little bit about that so people could be aware of what your effort there and your dedication to that mission today.
One of the things that I think is so important is character development. And there are three legs to this character development. I'm not talking about self-esteem. Self-esteem is what wusses want and snowflakes want. They don't want their feelings hurt.
Right.
The first thing is education. That's formal education, academics, math, science, history, valid history, truthful history, English literature, that what helps you make you think. All the things you need to learn in school, art, music, everything else. Then there's the peripheral education, which is somewhat from semi-formal to informal, which went through Boy Scouting or being a member of various clubs or organizations. you know, like baseball or football, learning how to, you know,
Sure.
play nice with people,
Play by the rules.
play by the rules, develop skills, eye-hand coordination, that kind of stuff. And one of the things, you got to concentrate on yourself, we tell young people. You got to concern yourself first. You need to count yourself first before you count anybody else.
And the reason why?
And the reason why is if you don't have that education and the skills you need, you can't help anybody else. The next thing, and the next leg of that, is implementing all that education you got. That's including mentoring. You know, if you're 15 and you're an Eagle Scout, there's a lot of things you can help with the younger ones. If you're a Girl Scout, the older ones can help the younger ones. It's picking up trash when you walk your dog. It's because you want your neighborhood to be clean and nice. Helping an 86-year-old neighbor, you know, get their
Sure.
mail without them struggling with a walker down their sidewalk or whatever, or their driveway. Implementing things, organizing award ceremonies, parties, organizing radio controlled car organizations, learning to implement all this education. And the older you get, the more you learn, the more you can help other people, improve your community.
Sure.
And the third
Civic
leg,
pride, we don't hear about that anymore.
yeah, civic pride. Then the third thing rather, is to be able to pass on your culture. Okay, in the United States, what do I mean by culture? The Constitution of the United States and what it stands for.
Indeed.
That American flag symbol. Yes, we've had problems. We've had slavery and Jim Crow laws. But what other nation in this planet has gone out of their way with each generation to make things better? Yes, we had slavery. And by the way, the United States did not start in 1619. It started in 1776. The first year of the war, we were trying to fight for the rights of Englishmen. We were an English colony, so Nimrods. And to understand the development of how we've gone through court actions, through peaceful means to improve things, you know, through changing the Constitution to make things like slavery illegal, to equal the 14th Amendment.
All done without coup d'etats.
Without having a rifle involved in it.
Indeed.
And we have for almost going on 3 centuries now, passed the leadership of the country peacefully to the next person that won the election.
Yes.
Now you can argue the quality of the election all you want. And the thing is that I think we really need to concentrate on ignoring skin color. We need to operate what Martin Luther King said. The only thing that counts, and that's part of the character development and education
Indeed.
about a person, is the content of their character. It doesn't matter if you're 6 feet tall or 5 feet tall, if you're black, white, Asian, or whatever. If you adhere to the principles set down in the Constitution and the things set in the Declaration of Independence and our codes and our laws, and you believe in the fact that, like Voltaire has alluded to, implied, but he really never said it, was the fact that I may not agree with you, but I will defend your right to say it to the death.
Indeed.
And those are the things that I'm talking about, character development education. And we're working here in Alabama. We've got 3 school systems. I'm also part of the Youth Leadership Development Program, which we've got 95 high schools. And we're using a lot of the character development from the Medal of Honor Society in that program.
Wow.
Along with that, we've got 27 universities that are supporting our Youth Leadership Development Program. And the purpose is to educate people. And by education, I mean, tell them you don't tear down a statue. Look at that statue and say, okay, what does that mean? What does it affect you? Does it affect you today? No. But it was a symbol once upon a time. What was that symbol? Was it a good symbol or a bad symbol? If it's a bad symbol, explain it.
Yeah.
Don't hide the swastika. You know, let's not blow up Buddhist statues because we're Christians or Buddha or Muslims.
Right.
Whatever. You know, and this thing about cultural appropriation. Oh my God. What society hasn't appropriated culture? You know, every place in the world, you know, is like, where did alphabets begin? You know, if you look at Japan, Korea, and China, their alphabets look very similar because they all had the same roots. So is that not cultural appropriation? But it's there's a lot of good. If you look at the Roman Empire, they were the great cultural appropriators with roads and aqueducts and military equipment. You know, there's nothing wrong with using ideas from other cultures. In fact, I think that's the greatest compliment that a culture can. You can come to this country and you bring part of your culture with you, and then people look at it and say, yeah, that's a great idea. And you appropriate it.
Yes.
And then your culture can play. See, that's our piece of the American culture.
Indeed.
And it's a good piece. It's a piece that everybody, regardless of where you come from, can use and help better their life. And that's what education's about.
Amen. And as we close out here, Mike, any final thoughts? Particularly since first of all, what did it feel like on October 23rd, 2017, at the White House on the podium with the president awarding you our nation's highest decoration?
It was when I said, you know, I somewhat ignored because was kind of bizarre, and I don't mean in a bad way.
No.
I mean, it's like you become every place I went in the Pentagon and my face was everywhere, you know, it's like.
Indeed it was. How did I get here?
Yeah, you walk down, a funny story. I kept walking in the Pentagon and they just kept waving me through. I had an escort. What I didn't know was the escort had my badge. And so the first day I'm in there, I have to go to the bathroom.
Right.
So I start walking out to go to the bathroom because I didn't know you know.
Yeah.
And they said, wait a minute, you got to take this with it. I said, what's this? This is your badge. Badge. I didn't know I had a badge. Oh yeah, I've been carrying it for a day. So that's one. And then the top that out is every time I go back to the hotel, I have to get a new key. Well, after the second day, the clerk just started handing me one. Because what was happening is every time I went through security at the Pentagon, it was zeroing out my hotel room key. The electronic monitor.
Yeah. Powerful monitor, huh?
But I will tell you this much.
Yes.
Mr. Trump is a gentleman. He introduced my wife to the nation and my grandchildren.
And your grandson even had a moment in the West Wing, did he not?
Oh yeah. Boy, this kid he's either gonna be hung or become president. Well, he was standing next to the president when he was signing the certificates and stuff for my medal.
Right. Yes,
they
sir.
do that in the Oval Office with your family.
Right.
So afterwards, he pats the president on the back and thumbs up, you know, and his mother is going, you know, I can just see the Secret Service.
Secret Service.
Yeah, just kind of. So he walks back around me, pulls on my sleeve, and he says, can I get his autograph? I said, Christian, ask him. The man's sitting right there. So the president goes like this with his finger up in the air, and his secretary brings stationery. He writes an autograph for Christian, and he brings him one of the MAGA hats, and he signs that.
Oh, wow.
And then he says, can I get one for my sister? So he gets one for her sister. Then Margaret says, well, can I get one? So he gets one for Margaret. And then he looks dead at the President of the United States of America in the Oval Office. His mother just was,
cringy.
And he says, can I get one for Mrs. Fisk?
Oh.
The president turns around in his seat and gets his hands down and looks straight at Christian, right in the eye, and says, who's Mrs. Fisk? Well, that's my teacher.
Oh.
Well, okay. So he goes like this. He said, why? And he says, well, can you write it asking her to excuse me for this week's worth of homework? So he did. So we later on, Christian did a video of his thing in D.C. that week.
Yeah.
And he showed it to his class, and we had it framed for Mrs. Fisk.
Oh.
But I couldn't, and Mr. Trump was smiling. You could tell he was smiling because I looked at him, he was smiling, but he's writing, please excuse, you know, la la la, to get Christian out of homework. And I told him later, I said, you know, if this doesn't get you out of all that work you're missing this week, nothing will. You know?
Yeah, you bought the farm in this one.
Oh yeah, we're going into the White House, and you know we have this Secret Service in. There's no video or anything. And I look over there with his mother and the grandmother, and there's Christian with his cell phone on the video, just going like this. You know? I mean, the kid's going to get us in jail.
Yeah.
But yeah, we had there were funny things like that, and there were some pretty solemn moments.
Indeed.
And then one of the things is that my wife was escorted into the room on the arm of the vice president.
Wow.
That was cool.
Yeah, sure.
And then I followed the president in. Well, after the ceremony was over with, I stood back like I was told because we had a rehearsal. And the president's supposed to go first. And this is tradition. He's the last one to come in the room and the first one to leave, right?
Right.
He looked right at me and went like this. And I walked out ahead of the President of the United States.
I remember that.
And
Wow.
that's a tradition that he broke. And I mean, that kind of thing is just astounding. The little simple acts of kindness that he's done.
Yeah.
And he was very kind to my grandchildren. And you could tell he was enjoying.
Well, you also had a briefing with him with all the men who were able to attend that.
Yeah. Oh, and
From your team.
he was supposed to stay a few minutes to take photographs. He spent a half an hour with us.
Wow.
And you could see the schedule was kind of, But he was having a fun time with, and it's funny that we have a photograph of it. It looks like it was an advertisement for walkers, canes, and oxygen bottles,
Right.
Because this is he
Sure.
were a lot, basically physically have been broken in the service of this country.
Yeah. 47 years later.
That is not unusual for Medal of Honors to be awarded decade. In fact, it's more the norm than it is the,
Right.
because what is it? Williams got his of what, 100 and,
How many years? 130 years later?
Mr. Obama gave the medal to his descendants of a young man who was with the 4th Volunteer Field Artillery Regiment from Rhode Island.
Rhode Island.
And he received his for action on July 3rd, 1863.
In Gettysburg.
Well, and that's my point about this country. We make errors, we make mistakes, but we try to fix them.
Indeed.
Unfortunately, a lot of times it's decades after the people that were injured or ignored or not recognized.
Sure.
But at least we try. And that sums up this country. We have problems, we have faults, but we try on a daily basis to fix those things that aren't right, or at least most of us try.
Indeed. I think that's a great note to close on, Mike. Thank you for coming with us today. We really appreciate it. And we also want to say thanks to all the veterans out there, men and women like you that have served our country, who fought the wars for our country, truly an American hero, someone we look up to. To those of you out there on the front lines today, now, we thank you for fighting for all of our ideals for police, law enforcement, the Border Patrol, Secret Service, paramedics, frontline, correction officers, others that are out there every day serving the better of our country and mankind here. And thank you to all that do this so that we can live in safety today. And of course, we thank all of our armed services. And for those who didn't come home, we salute you. Till next time.